Hello and welcome back to Dare Me to Prosper. This is episode 3. Forgive my raspy voice again. I am still recovering from whatever this is. And I do have kids home today. So if you can hear noise in the background, that's what that is. Ironically, because I do actually want to talk about kids today and about parenting and sort of how kids and parents and parenting in general is evolving. And before I even get into this, let me just say I am nowhere close to a perfect parent or even necessarily somebody that you should be taking advice from at all. But it's more so this is just, again, a conversation that I want to start diving into, because it's just something that I've picked up on while kind of observing other parents and observing kind of the culture of parenting and where we're headed and reading parenting books and talking to other parents. The nature of parenting, the nature of children, and the nature of parents is all changing. As, things do. Cultures are always changing. Dynamics between people are always changing. But it's a really interesting topic, and I think it would really benefit us to kind of change with the way things are going in a good way. There's several trains going on at once, if you know what I mean, in terms of parenting, good trains and bad trains. We want to be on the good train, but we want to go and kind of follow our children into this new age of parenting. So that's what we're going to talk about. That's kind of an overview. So I am a millennial parent. I've got 3 kids. Their ages are 5, 8, and 10. And so I'm kind of out of the baby phase, but I'm not yet in the preteen phase. I'm kind of right there in a sweet spot in the middle, sometimes sweet, sometimes not so sweet. So I've been in it for a second, right? And I have noticed something about these children. Now, our children, as a millennial, the new children that are, I think they're still being born now, are Generation Alpha is what they've been called. And then behind them is Generation Beta, which I don't know if Generation Beta, if they've started being born yet. I know that that's what the generation is called. I don't know if we're in Generation Alpha or Beta in terms of babies being born today, but Generation Alpha is what all 3 of my kids are. And this generation has gotten a really bad rap, right? They have been called everything from the iPad babies to just this generation of kids that can't be taught. They are terrible in school. They're having all these behavioral issues. And then you've got gentle parenting going on. And there's a lot of talk around this generation, how to parent this generation. And I want to say I've picked up on some things about this generation that are consistent. No matter who the parent is, I think there's in general sort of some consistencies in this generation that we didn't necessarily see in other generations. So one of the first things that I've noticed about Gen Alpha is they are very stubborn. They're very stubborn. They're very self-assured. They're very authoritative. They do not want to be parented. They do not want to be taught. They kind of came in they have this sense who they know who they are and what they want, for better, for worse. Now, they're still kids, so that doesn't mean that knowing who they are and what they want is going to lead to good behavior and, that they can be their own parents. No. They still need guidance, but I believe more than previous generations that these kids really come in saying, this is who I am, this is what I want, and if I see something or I notice something, even if I don't know why logically that my parent is doing, that my teacher is doing, that I don't like, I'm going to tell you. These kids are not going to be blindly parented. They're not going to be blindly led. They don't do blind obedience where yes ma'am, no ma'am, just because you said so. Now, every kid is different. There's obviously going to be nuance in all of this, but as a generation, they are very stubborn and they know what they want. Also, I want to note, I can link this video in the show notes if anybody is interested, but I did watch a video by an astrologer because I've really gotten into astrology lately and I just find it to be so interesting and pretty spot on in terms of being able to describe certain things or predict certain things. And this astrologer in this particular video was talking about the different generations and kind of their overall purpose, their overall collective purpose here on Earth. And and kind of what that generation was meant to do. And, going through, you can obviously see, and I can't remember all of them, so I can't really quote them for you, but you can see changes in generations, like what changes did the boomers come and make? What changes did Gen X come in and make? Millennials, when millennials started growing up, there was huge changes happening in the world. And millennials, I think, were also that generation to come in and be like, this isn't working. All these traditions, this way of doing work and how the corporate workforce is. We don't like that. We're going to change it. This way of parenting, all this general trauma we had, we're going to call you guys out on it and say, hey, we were traumatized as children. We're going to talk about it now. Millennials kind of grew up and they kind of pulled out the rug. They pulled the rug out from under, all of these different systems and said, this isn't working and we need change. And then Gen Z came in, and Gen Z is kind of this generation of the underdog, and they're really big on human rights, and they're really big on political arguments and standing up for causes that they believe in. Gen Z is all over that, and I think that's been pretty obvious to most people. Well, Gen Alpha, I remember this woman talking about Gen Alpha and saying how Gen Alpha really kind of came in with this purpose to kind of flip the narrative around a little bit, that they were going to teach us. That Gen Alpha came in with these old souls, and they came in to kind of be like, hey, you guys aren't doing X, Y, and Z right. A little bit like the millennial. And to say, we are not going to let you walk all over us as children. We're going to come in and demonstrate for you. Now, granted, I'm not talking about like bad behavior as a child and that's the way we need to act. Again, children still need to be led, but as they grow up, these children are going to be kind of the ones that are going to lead the way for us to rebuild these new systems that we've now recognized aren't working. So the millennials kind of came in and were like, hey, and that isn't working. We're breaking these systems apart. We don't like this 9 to 5. We don't like this corporate world. We don't like the way the taxes work. We don't like the way whatever it is. And Gen Alpha is going to be the ones to kind of go behind us and now repair all of those systems. Like, hey, we need this new educational system that works this way. We need this new financial system, this new government system that works this way as they grow into adults. And so right now what's happening is these Gen Alpha kids are like wrecking the school system because they are not agreeable to the way that the current systems work. They're not agreeable to the way that the current education system is working. Now, granted, I think it's a little bit serendipitous in terms of it's kind of divinely happening, right? It's not that they necessarily even have the awareness that they're doing this, right? But they have phones in their hands and they're distracted. So it's not like they're cognitively aware of what's happening and they're coming in and saying, hey, Mrs. So-and-so, I really don't appreciate the way that this educational system works. And I think I have some better ideas. No, it's not. It doesn't work that way. But the energy for change is there. And so you have these kids that are on their phones or they're just not paying attention. They don't respond to sitting in a desk all day and getting all this information and then regurgitating it on paper like we've all been made to do for however many years now, right? They are just inherently have decided, I don't like this. I'm not going to conform to this, and even if that comes out in a way that's really disruptive, like behavioral issues or just not paying attention or not making good grades, it's kind of this just rebellious spirit. Gen Alpha is very rebellious because they kind of have to be. If you look at it from kind of a bigger picture, kind of divine way, like the astrology describes, Gen Alpha really has this rebellious spirit because they have to be the ones to kind of refuse the system that we have now. They're refusing it and they're forcing the system to change because they just won't fit into it. They won't fit the mold. They refuse. I would say Gen Alpha is also really good in general. Obviously, all of these are generalizations. Not every kid is going to be described by all of these things I'm saying. But in general, I think Gen Alpha is pretty good at expressing themselves and their needs if given the opportunity. I think they have a greater awareness of their own identity, of their own emotional intelligence. Like I know for a fact my kids will they will absolutely throw it back in my face if I have done something that they don't like. Like, they will be the first ones to say, you can't talk to me like that, or don't raise your voice. They're like these little parents. They really are. And, I find myself saying, well, I wouldn't have done that when I was your age. Because I wouldn't have, and because a lot of us wouldn't have, because I just truly think that Gen Alpha is different. They are built different, and they are not afraid to challenge authority, and they're not afraid to challenge adults. And I think that is because these are skills that they are meant to have and meant to use as they grow older and really shift the world as we know it, just like millennials did, just like other generations did in other ways. So this episode, again, is really going to explore, we're going to talk about, this might be a little bit longer of an episode because I feel like I'm still just getting into it, but it's going to explore how we can parent these children while also supporting them and recognizing that they are the way they are for a reason, without, gentle parenting to a fault and letting them walk all over us, and kind of just finding this good balance of ending generational trauma, but also being good parents and good guides to these kids who have a role that we need to respect. So far we've kind of talked about how these kids are different, how kids have evolved, maybe a little bit of why they've evolved. So again, there's also the outside aspect, like, I think inherently kids are changing, but also part of that is because of what's happening on the outside. It's environmental, right? It's new, it's access to information that they wouldn't have had before. It's technology, for better, for worse. We have these iPad kids that are given too much technology. And I do personally think that we're going to see maybe a pendulum swing, like all these iPad babies that we're forming. I think at some point, Generation Alpha is going to grow up, and there's going to be a movement of like, whoa, we're all addicted. And I think Gen Alpha we might see, and it'll depend on where technology is and what's going on and how it's changing. But I think we may see Gen Alpha kind of really push back against the millennial parents who did allow their kids to become iPad kids and go, whoa, we need to push back against this. This is affecting us really badly. Look at the mental health issues I've suffered because of this addiction, and look at the opportunities that I missed out on because my face was glued to a screen. And I think they're going to pendulum swing. I have no idea what that looks like, but that's honestly what tends to happen when you have a whole generation that grew up with this one negative trait. I think they grow up and then they pendulum swing and they push back and they make changes, which is a healthy way to do things. Maybe a generation before makes a mistake that the next generation can come in and sort of fix or find a solution for. So I do think we're going to see that. As far as kind of moving on to the struggles that parents are facing because of this, and I know I already mentioned this a little bit, but it is no easy task parenting a self-assured, strong-willed child. I'm sure many of you can also relate to having kids like that, and then we've got a lot of neurodivergent children that are, ADHD or autistic or whatever it is. We've got a lot of new challenges that come with being a parent. And a lot of the traditional parenting methods that we were raised on, or that have just been traditional ways of parenting that we are now sometimes still being taught, those things backfire. Coming down on a strong-willed child with a hammer backfires on you. And if you have a strong-willed child, the harder you try to come down on them, the harder they fight back. They are not going to lay down and take it. And it will come back to bite you, and it will come back to harm the relationship between you and your child. And I think a lot of us inherently know this from especially, millennials and somewhat Gen X, I think, and Gen Z. If you were raised in a very strict household or a very, traumatic household where there was a lot of yelling or fighting or being beaten with a belt or whatever, however it looked, I think we know we want to change that. So we grow up and we go, that didn't work and that was traumatic, or I didn't like that. I don't want to do that with my kids. And then we're looking for new methods, right? So we're turning to all these other gurus, so to speak, and saying, well, what do I do here? I have this strong-willed child. They don't want to listen to me. They don't want to do this. They don't want to do that. I still need to be able to be their parent and to guide them, and I need to teach them things, but they just flat out won't listen. But I don't want to traumatize them. What do I do? And a big issue that we have now is that there's not a lot of clear guidance because there's a lot of different voices now saying different things. Over here, you have gentle parenting. Over here, you still have people that are like, I turned out fine. And, this, that, and the other. And I really feel like it's just it's very confusing now for parents to try to find something that works to parent these kids with all of these different needs. Yes. So the goal is to really find a middle ground between permissive parenting and authoritative parenting, where we're not being passive and permissive and letting them walk all over us, but we're also not being traumatizing them, abusive, emotionally abusive. We are allowing them the space to be themselves, to learn, to grow, to start to gain independence over time, while also holding boundaries to be like, that's actually not okay. We don't act that way. We don't speak that way to people. We don't do X, Y, and Z. That is not always easy. And even the things that I might mention today may not work for you at all, because maybe you have different challenges that I don't have, and maybe I'm not even thinking about in this moment. So there is no one size fits all here. It is just a conversation that hopefully will get your wheels turning, and maybe you are able to bounce ideas off of somebody or me. I always leave my email in the show notes if you would like to, if you have a question or you want to talk about something. But that's the goal, right? Okay, so, the gentle parenting movement was really, it was built on this idea of like collaboration and respect and emotional support, which I love, and which I've read so many parenting books on this sort of topic of how do I get my kid to listen to me without traumatizing them. And it is a lot of those things. Without calling it gentle parenting, a lot of, experts and psychologists and things do offer very similar advice, which is collaboration, discussion, respect for your child, because that in turn will often help them build respect for you, and emotional support. The problem is that they don't always mention the flip side of that, of how to hold a boundary. Or I find oftentimes that they don't give a lot of concrete examples. Like, I feel like a lot of times I will read parenting books, and I've read quite a few. In fact, I will list some in the show notes if you're looking for good books that I might recommend. But I find that some of them do lack practical advice with enough situations. Like, okay, give me some situations of what this looks like. When my kid says XYZ, what do I do? When my kid hits the sibling, when my kid does whatever it is, what do I do in that moment? I have a hard time connecting the advice to the situations, because I feel like it's a lot of talking in circles without the actual applicable advice. And so I am going to get to that as well, because that was a big thing for me. And also, tip, if you want to read a lot of parenting books and you just do not have time, a hack that I have used that I would highly recommend is using ChatGPT. You can go to ChatGPT and you can say, hey, ChatGPT, give me a summary of this book. What are kind of the main highlight points? What are the action steps that this author recommends? And then give me some examples. I have an 8-year-old boy, and this is my issue. Can you give me some examples? If he did this, according to the information in this book, how might I respond? Give me an example. Let me tell you, I would pay so much money for this tool. The information like that I have gotten out of it is amazing. And then I would give it more books. I'd be like, okay, summarize this book. Okay, now take the information from all of those books together. Tell me if you were to summarize all the tools or all the advice from all of them, and what I found doing this, and a lot of these books I did actually read, but it was a long time ago, or I just don't recall necessarily all of the same information that, AI can recall. What I found was that most of them are giving the exact same information. Basically, when you boil it down to it, it was all coming down to the exact same information. And so if I were to really, 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 really cliff note it, because there was a lot of helpful information, but if I had to boil it down to 3 points, the main things that a lot of these books were saying was, 1, validate their emotions. Like, recognize their emotions, recognize that you understand how they're feeling. Like, hey, voice it. I see that you're really upset because XYZ. That makes sense. Everybody feels that way sometimes. I see that you're really angry because, your sister did this. I see that you're really angry because your brother called you this name, and that's not okay for him to do. Then step 2, then you hold the boundary. Okay, I recognize that you feel this way, but we can't do this. You can't speak to me that way, and tell them why. you can't speak to me that way. It really hurts my feelings. And, how would you feel if somebody else spoke to you that way? You can't hit your sister because that's violent, and we can't be violent. That is, it's not safe for other people. Grown-ups are not allowed to do that, certainly. And so this is something we learn now when we're little. And then the third thing, you recognize their emotions, you give them the boundary that you're not allowed to do. I'm not going to allow you to whatever, X, Y, Z. And then you collaborate. So then you basically put the ball in their court. Be like, all right, clearly this is an issue that we're having. How can we work this out? What is something that we can do to find a solution here? It doesn't mean that they get the final say, that you're being like, okay, yeah, you think a bucket of candy every morning for breakfast? Great. No, you still have the final call as the parent, but what you're doing is you're putting some power in their court. It shows them that you respect them. You're the parent, you're in charge, but you're not steamrolling them. You're making them do the brain work. You're making them think about why this isn't okay and what they could do instead. So you're not just telling them where they're just having to listen to you talk. You're making them think about it and respond to you, which helps whatever the issue is stick in their mind better. What could you have done differently in that situation when you were mad? Instead of throwing something, what could you have done differently? Oh, I couldn't punch a pillow. Yes, you can punch a pillow. I can take some deep breaths. Yes. And it's not always going to be easy, if they're mad or if they're frustrated, to get these answers out of them. But that was, I have found that actually just implementing this after kind of doing this exercise, that it has been very helpful. And I found it really interesting that when I took, these 5 or 6 books that I had given to ChatGPT, this is really, if you boil it all down to the most basic, most simplified strategies, this is what it was. And then there's some other things that I could add if I were going to go into all the different books. But that's really what it was, that it was trading punishment, which now I will say, not always trading punishment. If there is a boundary that's being broken over and over and over and over again, you won't stop hitting your sister. We've done this multiple times. Now we're going to have a consequence. So, the first time this happens, next time you're going to lose this privilege, or you're going to, sit in your room for a while, like whatever it is for you. It doesn't mean that there's no consequences whatsoever. But in general, that 1, 2, 3 step is, I have found, surprisingly helpful. Because, when you first listen to it, you're like, really? Like, my kid's not going to just try it. And then switch things up or move things around or do what works for you, because again, not everything works for every person. I will say another principle that I'm really trying to focus on, especially as my kids get older, and it works in a different way when your kids are toddlers, but that's autonomy and independence, right? Because the main goal as parents, one of the main goals, I should say, is building independence and autonomy, like giving them the confidence to grow up and make good choices on their own and have a firm sense of who they are and their identity and their ability to make good choices or to, critically think, right? And a lot of that comes with practicing and making mistakes when they're little. So when they're 2, that might look like just having them make little choices. Do you want to do this or do you want to do that? Or, if it's a correction thing, well, I talk to my kids a lot about good choices and bad choices. Like, that was a bad choice, not tying it directly to your kid. Like, why are you such a screw up? I heard that one when I was younger. So, one time, not consistently. I do have a good relationship with my parents now. But, what is, saying that was a bad choice? You made a bad choice. You had better choices that you could have made. What are some of the better choices? And really focusing on allowing them to make the mistakes now, and then helping them to recognize, like, oh, that wasn't a great choice. What's a better choice we could have made? From the time they're 10, and again, I've only parented up through a 10-year-old, so don't talk to me about the teenage years. I'm sure that will come with its own challenges, but really giving them the ability to make good choices and then possibly make mistakes. Like, I will say, there was a recent incident where I caught my 10-year-old like sneaking a bunch of Halloween candy, right? Like, sneaking it behind my back, eating however, buckets and buckets, like half the bucket was gone. I was like, why are these so unbalanced? And so we had this conversation about trust and being like, if you want more authority, more independence, less rules around certain things, then I got to be able to trust you, right? I have to be able to trust that you are going to make some good decisions even when nobody is watching. And so you need to practice making those good decisions. If somebody hands you a whole bucket of candy, can you be trusted to eat a few pieces and not eat the entire bucket. And maybe they do need to make that mistake one time and get the stomach ache, just as an example. But because usually, and I want to take this kind of as my own critique too, a lot of times when that happens, there is maybe some feeling like from that child that they're being too restricted, that they don't have enough authority, and therefore they feel like they need to sneak, right? So that might be my clue to be like, okay, we need to loosen the reins, give some more freedom to make these choices, and let them make the mistake on their own, have the natural consequence. There's lots of different ways that you could kind of go about this, but I just want to use that as an example of an area where I'm practicing giving more authority, more autonomy to the child, and letting them maybe make good choices, make bad choices, talk about the good choices, talk about the bad choices. And you just kind of practice that in different situations. And the goal is that obviously when they get to be teenagers, when they get to be young adults, they've had so much practice, they've had the space to make good choices or make bad choices and make mistakes. They've been able to learn those lessons on their own, and they've been able to practice what they like and what they don't like. Does that make sense? Because I do see now, I know people my age that didn't have room to express themselves or make certain decisions around what they wanted. It was a lot of what their parents wanted, making the parent happy, dressing in a way that their community or their parents approved of, doing this thing, playing sports instead of being musical or whatever it is. And then these people grow up and there is a lot of confusion around, who am I? What do I even like? Or just trusting themselves to have confidence to make their own decisions rather than a lot of questioning around, I don't know, I'm nervous. What if I do this? Or what if this goes wrong? And I think that comes from a place of not having the freedom to make mistakes, to figure out what you like, to figure out what you don't like. Letting the childhood be messy, I think, is almost a good way to say it. The childhood needs to be a little bit messy in terms of letting these kids figure stuff out and giving them room to do that rather than kind of keeping them on this straight and narrow path. Nope, don't make that mistake. Don't make this mistake. Don't go too far over here. No, you need to act this way. Let it be a little bit messy, because that is how they figure out who they are and what they like and what, they have the confidence to make their own decisions. Anyway, I feel like I could do an entire other episode on this because there's so many different pathways and conversations, side conversations that you could have on this one topic. But this was just kind of an overarching conversation that I wanted to have, for myself. And just this is a conversation that I like having with other parents as well. So again, I'm going to leave my email in the show notes. If you have any episode suggestions, topics that you would like me to approach, or maybe even interviews, at some point I will get to having guests on the podcast, so I'm open to suggestions there. And thank you for listening. I just want to assure parents that we are all imperfectly parenting, and we're all learning as we go. And it is truly a journey, not a destination. There's no perfection happening. And we're all evolving and learning as we go, because that's just how it works. And this generation of parents is doing it differently than the generations that walked before us. And so we're all kind of figuring out what that looks like in real time. And that's going to take a minute. So I hope that you got something from this, or even just something to think about. I hope I don't listen back to this and think that, oh gosh, I worded that the wrong way, or that's not what I meant, because I feel like this is such a hot, controversial topic. But thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you. If you have gotten anything from this, I would really love if you left a review. It is so helpful. And I will see you next time. Thanks for listening to Dare Me to Prosper.